The Caro Kann Defense is one of my favourite openings ever, and hopefully in this video I'll be able to show you why. As part of the most educational chess speedrun on YouTube, my name is Alex and I'm a 2000 rated player. In this series we're going from 1000 to 2000 elo in chess.com rapid games, and during the games I'm going to be explaining my thought process as best as I possibly can. My opponent has played a strange variation of the Caro Kann, where he has taken on d5 after going knight to f3. Of course, in these variations, you're supposed to take with the c-pawn. Taking with the queen makes no sense, because knight c3 attacks your queen, and why did you bother playing c6 in the first place? The whole point of playing c6 is, of course, to take on d5. Don't just blindly play your openings. Know the reasons behind the moves you're playing. This is how you're going to get better at your openings. Now, this is an interesting version of the exchange Caro Kann. I'm going to start with knight to c6. My opponent goes c3, and this is pretty natural, except bishop to g4 is on the cards. And I want to delay it, so I'm going to play knight to f6 first, because my bishop has access to f5 or g4. And one of the main points of the Caro Kann is being able to get your bishop out and then play the move e6. As opposed to the French defense, where you play e6 then d5, you still challenge the center and you support your d5 pawn with another pawn, but your light squared bishop is locked away, which is why it's known as the French bishop, which is not a compliment. My opponent's kind of turning this into a bit of a London system, interestingly, and I think I'm now going to play bishop to g4. I wanted to see if my opponent would go bishop to d3 first, and then I can play bishop to g4. And it's just a bit more annoying for white because you don't really want to move the bishop back to e2 to unpin the knight. But I suppose, knight b to d2 can always be played to support the knight, and then the queen can probably come out this way. We'll see how it goes in this game. This is quite an unorthodox sort of exchange Caro Kann. But of course, your opponents can choose many ways to play, so you need to understand how to combat these many ways to play. Now, h3 is played. And we could take, but I see no need to give our bishop up just yet, because even if it does get pushed back with moves like g4 and bishop to g6, this is still a very good diagonal to be on. We have access to squares like e4, and if the bishop comes to d3 to trade itself off, that's absolutely fine, because after we play the move e6, we're going to have quite a few pawns on light squares. It wouldn't be unreasonable to put the a7 pawn on a6 either. So let's say that 6 out of our 7 pawns are on light squares. In that scenario, we're more than happy to trade off our light squared bishop, because it's not necessarily as needed, because our pawns are doing a great job at controlling the light squares. But our opponent has quite a few pawns on dark squares, so his light squared bishop is arguably a bit more valuable. Now that, of course, always comes down to this specific position, but it's just a good rule of thumb and something to consider when you're playing. My opponent goes bishop to e2, which of course unpins the knight, and I think we're just going to play e6. Prepare to bring our bishop either to d6 to challenge this bishop, or to e7, and then we're going to castle. My opponent castles, which also means that g4 is a bit more off the cards now. Let me think. I think I prefer bishop d6, because bishop g5 I don't think is concerning whatsoever. I think in those positions, I actually would want to play a move like queen c7, to unpin my knight and prepare knight to e4. And if my opponent takes to damage my structure, I still haven't committed my king anywhere yet. So I could play king e7 or castle queenside and use the g file to my advantage alongside my queen and bishop battery. That looks pretty promising. My opponent plays queen d2 here, which of course supports the bishop. I think queen d2 makes sense, because you're also making sure that the queen is no longer on the same diagonal as my light square bishop. It does mean that I can play the move knight to e4 though, which just attacks the queen. And I don't really see what white gains there. I think, however, that queen to c7 might be more accurate, because we're threatening to win the bishop, right? If bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, we kind of have the same position as we would have here, if my opponent would take immediately. But the queen on d2, I don't think is a benefit for white whatsoever. Unless if queen c7, take, white's planning on queen g5. Maybe there. Maybe that's the idea. So, with that in mind, maybe knight to e4 first makes more sense, because if takes, we of course take the queen. So if knight e4, queen e3, queen c7, takes, there is now no longer queen g5. And I'd argue the queen is a little bit misplaced. Also, the d2 square the knight wants to go to, which is why I'm kind of not wanting to play knight e4 immediately, because I'd love the knight to go to a3. It kind of sucks. It just kind of sucks on a3. The knight really should go to d2 typically. However, in this specific circumstance, I think knight to e4 makes more sense. Just simply winning a tempo on the queen, and the queen has to stay connected to this bishop. So either she goes to c1 or she goes to e3. I don't think either of them make a major difference, to be honest. If you're enjoying the video so far, by the way, and you haven't already, please drop a like and subscribe. It really helps to motivate me to keep making these videos for you guys. G5 is kind of an idea in some scenarios, with like rook g8 sort of things, but I don't, maybe not in this particular position. Although, if g5, white can't take that, because if bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, knight takes, at the end of all those lines, because the queen no longer defends the bishop and the knight moves, the bishop on e2 hangs. So if g5, the pawn cannot be taken. Now, my opponent could, of course, take my bishop, and the pawn still can't be taken. Although maybe it can, because if knight takes, I can't play knight takes because if bishop takes, so I'd have to take his bishop, but then he can take my knight with an attack on my queen. So okay, that's an interesting idea, but I don't think it works. Let's play queen c7 and encourage a trade of the dark-squared bishops, but this will of course be on our terms. My queen is very well situated because, like I was saying, we have a lot of pawns on light squares, which means our light squares are very strong, but obviously our dark squares are going to be a bit weaker now. And yes, we've traded off our dark-squared bishop, but my queen is doing an excellent job of making up for that right now. And the queen is very well situated. It's very difficult for white to put any pressure on her. There's no way a knight can attack the queen, and obviously there's no way a dark-squared bishop can attack the queen because they're off the board. So the queen is really nice. My bishop applies good pressure. My knight is very active. I think castles makes the most sense here. Moves like a6, b5 always exist, but let's just get castled. And knight bd2 is the move I expect, challenging my knight in the center. He goes for it. Now the question is, do we play f4? I think that's the big question. And I think that is technically known as a Pillsbury knight, when you have pawns like this defending the knight, and maybe when there's a pawn back on e6 as well. But essentially, we just glue the knight in place, and taking would be most likely a bad move, because we take with the f-pawn, open up the rook, we control f3. That's just a very nice position. We can rotate this knight to f5 even. Rotating the knight to f5 now would even be a not horrible idea. But, of course, I don't want to allow take, and I don't think bishop to g6 makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, take, knight back to d2, something like that. I think the bishop's nice on h5. So I think f5 has to be the move. I think it has to be. And I don't have to be worried about my opponent putting a knight on e5 to try and counteract my knight on e4, because he only has one pawn supporting him. We have two, right? That's the difference. Now, my opponent could try and play the move f3 to kick my knight out at some point, but one, that's going to be difficult to do because his knight is currently in the way. And one of the downsides of playing the move h3 is that if f3 gets played, there is, of course, a massive weakness on the g3 square. Okay, interesting. My opponent goes knight g5. The first move that came to mind was f4, almost trapping the queen. The queen only has d3 and then we can take the knight, except it doesn't work because after f4, I think my opponent can just take on e4, counter-attacking my queen. We would probably have to take knight d6. We could take on f2 with check there, though. And after the king moves, we could take the rook with promotion. Ooh, maybe that works. Because, of course, I don't want to take the knight. That would kind of ruin our plan. So the other thing to do would be to take the bishop, I think. But again, that's not really in the spirit of the position. I don't know, a move like bishop g6, I would argue, probably makes more sense if I'm not going to go for my f4 idea. Because if knight takes, pawn takes, I mean, my rook is fantastic. And my queen's opened up, and this pawn is a big problem. I'm probably just going to double up on the f-file. And cause all kinds of problems for white. And of course, f3 can always be met with knight to g3, unless white takes, and then our pawn is equally strong. So, the question is, does f4 work? So, if the queen moves, we just win the knight. Although, actually, if f4, queen to d3, we should take the bishop first with an attack on the queen. And if knight takes e4... Ooh. Bishop d3, knight d6... What's the material count there? What's the material count? I think it's equal material. Maybe. So does this make sense? Maybe we take on g5, bishop h5. That doesn't look correct at all. Queen d3, is that an issue? Bishop e2. Of course, if my opponent takes on e2, then we just take the knight and we're winning. So the only idea would be to take on e4 with an attack on my queen. I don't know where we could move the queen, so I think we just have to take my opponent's queen. Knight d6 also attacks b7. Bishop a6 looks unnatural. Don't love it. Don't love it. So maybe bishop g6 makes the most sense. And we just support the knight. Of course, if g3 is played, again, we can consider f4. Maybe the situation changes now, but we always have knight to g3. We can retreat the knight if we really need to. We could potentially trade if we have to. But I'd rather trade on my terms and open up the f-file for my rooks. We could take on e2 immediately. We could. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense. I will have to check these lines with the computer afterwards because this is a difficult position. I don't think taking the knight makes any sense. Maybe it's good to trade the bishop off, though. Yeah, I'm actually going to trade the bishop. My thought process is that with all these light squared pawns clogging up the center, I think our bishop would be more of a liability than anything else if we were to keep it on the board. The computer may disagree with me, but from a purely theoretical positional perspective, I feel like that makes the most sense. Now my opponent's got a couple options here, because my bishop isn't attacking anything. He takes the bishop. I was expecting him to take the knight, but okay. h6 isn't a silly move at all. Just attacking the knight and provoking it to take. It could go back to f3, but that seems a bit silly. Rook f6, I think, is the move I'd rather play. If f3 trying to build up pressure on e6, something like takes, and rook g6 looks very strong. Again, f4 doesn't really work because of knight takes knight. Could we... Oh no, because then this knight isn't hanging. What am I on about? I was trying to think of take, and then f4, because then this isn't an option, but the knight isn't under threat. So, I think I like rook f6. Let's play it. The rook is, of course, defending e6. The rook is also preparing to go to g6 in some lines. I'm also not taking just yet, and I'm not playing h6 to provoke my opponent, because I would rather him take me without any provocation, because we save time. And if the f-file does open, I want my rook on f6 anyway, because I want to double up my rooks. So rook f6 is kind of a prophylactic move in a sense, because I know that doubling up on the f-file is going to be my plan. If I do have to force my opponent to move his knight, then okay, I have to do that. But this move order is better because my opponent takes. I don't think anything other than taking with the f-pawn makes any sense at all. It is worth noting that knight to e4 would come with a fork, but currently, of course, I am defending the square well. If maybe this queen was on a different square, like e1 or something, then maybe rook takes, pawn takes, knight takes could be an idea, but I don't think any of that works. Now, I assume this position is mostly equal, if not black being a little bit better. But I would take this position with the black pieces any day. I think rook a to f8 makes the most sense. Of course, my opponent's preparing f3. That is clearly the main idea here. So I'm building up pressure on the f-file to try and counteract that. If f3, maybe there's ideas of queen to g3 trying to cause a bit of an issue. I'm not sure whether they work though. If f3, we may have to take and play for e5, but I'd like to avoid that. Queen g3. Huh. The thing is, I would like to keep the queens on the board because it's more exciting and I feel like we have some attacking possibilities. I'd also like to play for e5, but this looks positionally winning now, because I was just saying that f3 is the whole idea. And we'll see what the computer thinks after the game if white did play f3. But, okay, the pawns are doubled. That's not the end of the world. That's not why this is a problem. The problem is that there's no f3. And this is a protected passed pawn. And you can't even try to undermine it with c4, because if take, it's still a protected passed pawn. And d4 would, of course, be weak. Now, I actually don't want to take this rook, because the knight wants to go to f1, so it can go to e3, which is the ideal square for the knight, because it blockades my pawn. I also don't really want to play e5, because then c4 actually comes with like threats of undermining my pawns, and they could just evaporate. The idea I like is knight to e7, I think. I could play b5. That wouldn't be silly. Just clamping down on the c4 square. Then maybe e5 is a good move. And I suppose the move b5 will always be a good move. If a4, I think a6. I think that would make the most sense. Although, then maybe white can change his attention after something like takes rook a1. So maybe knight to e7 is the correct idea. The point being, after knight e7, knight f5, if I can apply pressure to these squares before my opponent can, maybe that makes sense. Then again, even if the knight does get to f5, after white plays a simple move to defend the g3 pawn somehow, I'm more prone to my knight just getting traded off. So actually, maybe b5 is better, and I'm going to play it. And a4, I actually don't have to just play a6. I can play the move b4, trying to undermine white's pawns in a bit of a role reversal there. I think the interesting part about this position is that if we were to split the board in two right now, consider this to be one side of the board and this to be the other side of the board, right? That was a horrific rectangle. Over here, it's a 2v3, but the fact that the kings are here and also these are double pawns, they're not going anywhere. Over here, it's a 5v4. I should be able to win that. And b4 weakens the c3 pawn massively. That's very weakening. Can I target it particularly easily? I don't know. Maybe if I can get to b6, then I can try and come into one of these squares. Interesting, though. Maybe... Oh, maybe e5 makes sense now. Yeah, I feel like e5 makes a lot of sense. Let's play it. Of course, this is simply a threat, so I assume my opponent has to take me. And after pawn takes, knight takes, my knight is targeting these really weak light squares. And if my knight leaves the c-file as well, I have ideas of something like take and rook c8, going after the c3 pawn, which is obviously incredibly weak. Especially, yeah, the move b4 is not a good move. It can't be a good move. If white wants to stop the move b4 from me, I think it probably makes far more sense to play the move a3. And you could argue that that leaves some light squared holes, but b4 is horrific. Okay, my opponent takes. Alright, let's take. Taking with the pawn makes no sense there. The f-pawn just looks like a weakness. My king probably wants to go to a square like e6 to support the pawns. Ooh, really? Rook trade. Well, what if I just decline it? Part of me wants to play king f7, and after something like takes, or even take with the pawn, because the rooks are off the board, so it's not as weak. Okay, my king's active. But what about rook c6? The white rook can't access either c2 or f3 to defend the pawn. And then knight b1 is the only move to defend. The rook can't infiltrate very easily. I suppose maybe rook to f5? Oh, is that an issue? Maybe I missed rook f5, but my opponent seems to have also missed it, which is good. Okay, what do we have here? If knight d3 attacking the rook, rook f5 can still be played. Now, we do actually have an interesting tactic of knight b4, cb4, and rook to c1 check, but there's rook to f1, unfortunately. Even if rook to f1 wasn't a thing, the d-pawn would be hanging at the end of that line. We could play e3 immediately. e3, knight e2, knight c4. That does look decent. Oh, that completely... Yeah, no, I have to play that. That's got to be the move. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Oh, that is so nice. Now, maybe knight to f5... Sorry, maybe rook f5 can be played, but I actually don't care. I actually would give both these pawns up for this idea. This is really nice. Let me just double check. Knight c4. The pawn is protected. The c3 pawn is blockaded. But the really incredible thing about this position... The rook only has a few safe squares. The knight can't come to d2, the knight can't come to c3, and the knight can't come to a3. The knight has completely locked out the game. No, my opponent just can't move. My knight is occupying basically all their pieces. Well, alongside my pawn, of course. Wow. Okay, now we just need to convert this. How are we going to do that? How are we going to do that? Well, it's difficult to get my rook to the back rank. I'd love to do this, but then I give my opponent the c3 square for his knight, so I'd like to avoid that if possible. I could bring the rook to the a file, but I don't think I'm doing a whole lot over there. So I'm going to start with rook f6. Partially to cut the king off, partially because I want the king to go to h2 to try and get into the game that way, because then rook f1 would end the game. The knight would be under attack. As we've established, the knight cannot move, and the rook can't go to e1 to defend the knight, and it also can't go to b2 because my knight controls that square. My opponent also can't contest me on the f-file because his rook is immobile, essentially. You'd have to go like rook e1, rook f1, but I don't know if that would even work, because if rook e1 and rook f1 get played, I have e2, I think. And if rook takes rook, I can promote with check. And the rook can retreat, but I just have a queen. I can just play something like queen e3 check. And now, I feel like my king can just march all the way to the e4 square and into like d3, and I'm not sure what my opponent can do about that. I'm really not sure. You know, he could play a move like g5, but just rook f5, and we attack the pawn. h4 defends the pawn. We could continue going after the pawns, but I think it would make more sense just to charge our king into the position, because my opponent's position is pretty much frozen. Okay, well, rook f4 just wins a pawn, doesn't it? It does, but I also don't want the pawn, because then the king can participate. I don't want it to. So I'm actually just going to ignore the free pawn. I know this is a skewer, but I don't really care. Because, you know, if my opponent goes g5, I don't know, just rook g5, sorry, rook f5, avoiding the trade. Okay, he goes for rook to e1. I think we should continue bringing the king. Now, it is worth noting that this pawn is no longer controlling the d2 square because my pawn on e3 is pinned, but I can just take with the knight, of course. And if rook takes e3, he wins my passed pawn, but I don't really care. I did have the move rook f2 there, maybe, although rook takes e3 would have been an issue potentially. Yeah, I think I'm... Oh, no, I can't. Because this comes with check. Ooh, that's interesting. That's interesting. Maybe I just continue bringing the king, though. And if take, I'm threatening to win his pawns. Fair play to my opponent for making this difficult, though. Yeah, this, here, and just king f2, and I'm probably losing there. Let's bring the king. King e5. I think because these pawns are doubled, like the pawns on the g file, even if my king runs all the way over here or something, I don't believe these pawns would be able to break through anyway. Because something like g5 takes, and my h-pawn controls both of the g-pawns. He stops king f4, but I think we just bring our king further in. King e4. And, okay, well, king f3 now just wins g3. I was expecting king g2. But we could just go win the knight, right? My opponent's got no way out. Again, these pawns pose no threat because g5 is the only way to try and break through. Take, and the g-pawns just get stopped by my 1h pawn. This is why I was saying earlier, yes, I've got a majority on the queen side, and my opponent has a majority on the king side, but his king side majority can't do anything. It's 2v1, but it doesn't do anything. Bring this pawn to h5 and it's a different story. g6 would be a problem. Here it isn't. I don't care. This does nothing. And obviously g4 does nothing. And now we're just winning the knight because it is completely trapped. He's just playing without a piece. That's really cool. That's really cool. And yeah, I assume my opponent may resign in a minute. But if he doesn't, the conversion is very easy. You know, king e2, king takes b1, and my knight is defending this pawn and it can't be moved. Okay, knight to a3, we of course take on a3, and we just bring the knight straight back to c4. We don't need to think about that. The knight's well defended, and the knight defends the pawn. That's all that matters. Now we just take, throw this pawn down the board, and the game is over. My opponent resigns on cue. Very, very nice endgame there. Really happy with that. I had an endgame actually kind of similar earlier on in the speedrun. So check that out if you're interested. If I remember, I'll link it at the end of the video. But let's get into the analysis and see what the computer has to say about the game. Okay, so the computer gives 87% accuracy for myself and 77.9% for my opponent. Certainly not a perfect game, but I'm sure there'll be a lot to be learned in the analysis. Of course, this is just a normal Caro Kann. And knight c3 would be more standard, leading to a just Caro Kann 2 knights. And there's loads of things black can do. Knight f6, bishop g4, d takes e4, even like g6 I've started playing recently. Loads of options. My opponent takes on d5, cd5, and we get an interesting version of the exchange variation after d4, because typically the knight doesn't go on f3 quite yet. Normally, in the exchange Caro Kann, after this gets played, something like bishop d3, and after knight to f6 or knight to c6, doesn't really matter. A very common move is h3, and the point is the bishop occupies the f5 square, and the pawn occupies the g4 square, and so this bishop can't get outside the pawn chain. So after some normal developing moves, there is knight b4 in some of these situations, so maybe c3 first. Black either has to go e5 to break out, or often has to play the move e6 and lock his light squared bishop in because there's not an obvious square for it. And white can get some pretty comfortable positions here. The way my opponent played it, though, with the knight already on the f3 square, allows me, after some normal developing moves, to put my bishop on g4. Now, the computer prefers bishop to f5. Personal preference, I like the bishop on g4. My opponent goes h3, and all three of these moves are absolutely fine. I go bishop h5, bishop e2, and e6. You can see the computer doesn't love this bishop e2 move. It's a little bit passive. Knight b to d2 makes a bit more sense. The bishop probably is happier on the d3 square. Maybe the queen can come to b3 now that the knight has support from the knight on d2. But bishop e2 is certainly not a bad move, necessarily. It's just maybe a little bit inaccurate. So e6, castles, bishop d6. The computer likes the immediate knight e4, but this is still fine. And queen d2 is not amazing, not amazing. We go knight e4, which is the better option. Queen e3. And queen b6? Okay, the computer wants to go wild here. Personally, I don't like these positions. I always feel very scared that my opponent's just going to rampage on the b file. I suppose my knight defends this square in this variation, but I don't like these positions. I suppose c4 isn't on the cards because I'll just trade queens, but if the queen trade wasn't available, I would be concerned about c4. But queen c7 is fine, of course. It's just a completely equal position. And now... Oh, why is my camera being weird? Let me fix that. Okay, that is better. A pretty dramatic lighting change, but the queen on d6 is a great piece. It controls a lot of important squares, and probably why my opponent opted to trade it off later. Rook e1, castles, these are all just normal moves, knight b to d2. And now I play the move f5, which the computer doesn't love. It doesn't. It wants me to take on d2. And after, like, knight takes d2, bishop takes e2, queen takes e2... I don't know why knight b8 was just recommended. Knight e7, maybe bringing the knight to the king side. I suppose black can expand on the queen side. I didn't go for this just because it's a really dull game, a really dull position. I didn't really want to play that. I thought f5 made things a bit more interesting. And knight g5 is played, and here I could not figure out what to do. Bishop e2 turns out to be the best move, so I'm very happy I chose that, but there's a lot of possibilities. Bishop g6 is a move, knight ge4, fe4, and yeah, we open up the f-file. The bishop supports the e4 pawn, but it's kind of a bad bishop. It's not great. And f3, white should be playing immediately to break out. What else was I calculating? Well, knight g5 doesn't really make any sense, because after queen g5, you're just under attack. If you then go and trade your bishop off, this is maybe a bit scary. The knight looks good coming to the e5 square, and without anything occupying e4, this is just a weak pawn. We need something on e4 to block the file off, so that's also off the cards. Now, I was calculating variations with f4. Yeah, I think I calculated this well. I'm really happy I calculated this correctly, because I think I'm right here. So my thought process was, well, knight g takes e4, f takes e3, knight d6, and I take on f2 with check and I win the rook. I'm just up in exchange. And I get to trade off more pieces. After something like this, 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 we're just up a clean exchange. This is a very good position. However, white can defend. Queen d3 changes everything. If I take on g5, then bishop h5, this is just a weak pawn, and my e pawn is weak, and something like knight to f3 blocks everything up for me anyway. And this light squared bishop is going to be very powerful. I did not want to play this position. So, knight g5 is off the cards, so I'd have to take on e2. But this doesn't work, because after knight ge4, bishop d3, knight d6, my b pawn is hanging, and my e pawn is hanging, and I can't defend both. Now, if this, I would have rook b8, I suppose, and I didn't really see that. But white doesn't even have to take here. This structure is bad if I don't get to take on e4, or I don't come out with extra material. The difference is that with the queen on d3, the position is the same, except after the trade, I'm not attacking anything. With the queen on e3, after pawn takes, I have multiple threats with the pawn. I did evaluate that correctly, so I'm really happy I saw that, and I chose bishop e2 because I thought, as much as I'd love to play something tactical here, it just doesn't work, and you need to know when to just say, you know what, I don't have anything here, let's just go for the simple option, get rid of my bad bishop, rook e2, I go rook f6, because h6 is a fine move, but if white's going to take anyway, then why provoke him? Rook f6, knight ge4, perfect. That's a mistake? de4 is better? And after f3, we go e5. Is the point that the file is open? de5, knight e5, fe4. The computer wants f4. Okay, well, I'm not gonna lie, I'm never finding that in a million years. I don't... If someone can enlighten me in the comment section, that would be fantastic. But, like, I don't know. This... I mean, you apply pressure to the knight, sure, but the knight just moves. And I mean, we control the only open file, okay? Maybe f3 is on the cards, but... I wouldn't want to be a pawn down here. This just looks... I mean, knight d4 just ends my attack, no? I go fe4. And I was concerned about the move f3. Definitely. This is clearly the best move. And I was like, well, ef3, knight f3, e5 is very weak, yeah, but I can apply pressure on the f-file. At some point, I may be able to play the move e5. And the game will be interesting, because this is a weakness, but it's defendable. If rook a8e1, for example, computer wants knight e7, my opponent can't take, because I'll just take with the rook. So it's not simple to win the pawn, and then maybe my knight rotates in somehow, and we get an interesting game. My opponent chooses rook f1. Wow, okay, knight e7 is... Sorry, not queen e7. Knight e7 is the move. And if f3, knight f5, yeah, that makes sense. And then we just push. Well, the computer prefers knight g3, actually, but pushing is also an option. And that is an issue. So white can't play f3. So white would probably have to offer a queen trade. And then we just get something similar to what we got in the game, except in the game it was voluntary. Here it's more forced. That's interesting. So my opponent should have gone f3. And again, we get a similar position after like ef3, rook f3, knight e7, and the same rules apply. This is a weakness. I can maybe go e5, but my knight is probably going to be active somehow, and we'll get a game. If I get the knight to the e4 square, things probably change. My opponent goes queen g3 though, and I was incredibly happy to have this trade. Queen g3, fg3. Computer thinks that black is almost winning, and yeah, there is equal material, but this is bad. This is bad for white, because as we saw in the game, this 3 versus 2 for white is kind of irrelevant. It's not doing anything. And this e-pawn is a problem, as we saw in the game. And c4 does, like, let's say... Wait, no, it's my move. Let's say, I don't know, here, 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 and c4. The d-pawn is hanging, of course, but even if the d-pawn wasn't hanging, this is not a threat. That's just not a threat, because I will take back and I'm fine. And if anything, the D pawn becomes weak. So this is not a great position for white. The computer wants h5, which I don't understand. I chose b5 to clamp down on the c4 square, which I thought made sense. My opponent goes b4, which is a horrific move. It's just really bad. I did consider the move a5, but I felt like after like b takes a5, the computer wants take, and rook a8. Okay, that makes sense, I suppose. But I thought, well, the rook maybe gets active on the b file. I don't really want to allow that. The knight blockades on e3 as well. That's kind of where the knight wants to go. Computer thinks that my rook and knight should be able to work together to win these pawns, probably. e5 is a miss, but that's only because I'm not playing the move a5, which the computer wants. e5 is still a good move. Taking is forced because you need to defend your d4 pawn, and knight b3 would hang the rook. So you could do something like rook f6, and knight b3 to defend, but then just take. If take, then take. If knight takes, this is probably winning because rook c4 is a threat, and the c file and the f files are the only open files, but I control most of the squares on the f file. Like rook f2, rook c4, if you try this, I just take here and defend. So d5 is forced, knight e5, rook f6, rook f6, rook f2. Now this is interesting, because taking makes no sense. This is almost a draw, because the king marches straight into the position, and I'm still better, but white is okay, because his king is so active. Rook c6 is a mistake, yeah, because of rook f5, which I completely blanked on. And I have to go back rook e6. I can try knight c4, and if knight c4, rook d5, rook c3, rook b5, this feels very, very artificial. Like rook a3, just rook e5, and everything gets traded, and the position is a draw. Knight b1, of course, loses the game. My opponent needed to play rook f5, but what else should I have done? Computer likes the immediate rook e6. I thought that king f7 didn't make any sense, because my opponent's just not going to take. Knight b3, and he's starting to set up like some good squares for his knight. You know, knight c4, knight d4, a6. I don't know, this position is unclear. I thought that rook c6 was a great move, just attacking the c-pawn. And the thing is, if rook to f5 doesn't exist here, then it is. But I just missed rook f5, but luckily so did my opponent. He goes knight b1, which I think is the losing mistake, because we find this e3 move. I don't know why the computer says it's a good move, because it's clearly the best move. It keeps suggesting this and then telling me it's not the best move. Knight d3? Rook d2? d4, you can't take because of this. I mean, I suppose, but not gonna lie, I think that my move e3 is far better, because after rook e2, knight c4, my knight freezes my opponent's knight. The c-pawn can never move, so the c3 square can't be accessed. The rook is stuck defending. My opponent tries to do something, but there's not a whole lot to be done. Rook f6 isn't the best move, rook a6 is better, but it doesn't really matter. h4. Here I can play rook f4, but the computer actually agrees with me that king to f7 is the better move, because these pawns don't matter. My opponent goes rook e1, I go king e6, rook f1, king e5, best move, very happy to see that, because we don't... See, I was initially like, well, okay, let's go back a few moves. If my opponent goes rook e1, let's say I go a6 and rook f1, then there's maybe ideas of e2, and if takes, then I promote, but the rook can just go to e1. And now my advantage is gone. But here, I can just ignore him, and after take, you split my pawns, but you're never getting through, ever. So g3, I mean, yeah, it stops my king from getting in, but I don't care. King e4, king f1. Again, I can go king to f3, but king d3, there's no way to save the knight. g5 does nothing. King c2, and the game is over, because the knight just can't get out. There's nothing here. A move like a4 doesn't work. Let's say the knight wasn't hanging here. In fact, the computer doesn't even want to take the knight. It wants to take on a4. This doesn't even destabilize my knight because it's already protected by the d-pawn. But even if it did, I'd still have the move a6 to just support my b-pawn. There is nothing white can do to break out of the position. The moment he plays knight b1, the game is over. As long as I find this setup, which fortunately, or whether you want to call it skill, I don't know, it's positional recognition. The knight, of course, belongs on the c4 square. e3 comes with a tempo. And once the knight gets on c4, there's nothing white can do. Maybe white could have fought on a bit harder. I don't really know what he could have done, to be honest. But yeah, we get the knight, king e2, knight c4 just returns to protect the pawn. And my opponent resigns because he's either going to have to give away all his pawns, or he's eventually going to have to move his king. And I will just get the c3 pawn, and the game is obviously over. Nobody should be not winning in that situation. But yeah, I think a very interesting exchange, Caro Kann, and a really, really cool endgame, if I do say so myself. Thank you very much for watching. If you want to see another equally cool endgame, I actually remembered, check out the video over here. It's not got a whole lot of views on my channel relatively, but it's a really, really cool game. And check out the playlist down here if you want to see the previous episodes of the speedrun.